My name is Julia Ehrt. I'm the director of Transgender Europe, and I'm moderating this side event on transgender people, mental health, and human rights. It is my great pleasure to have 4 seasoned speakers here on the panel and you in the audience. Just for some housekeeping, the event will be live streamed, I think, from over there, and it will be filmed from over there. So anyone who does not want to be seen in any of these should be sitting on this side of the room. All right? Other than that, we will have first interventions from the panel, and then plenty of time for discussion and debate and questions afterwards. I'll say that again, but I'd like to, afterwards, speaker to introduce himself, say the pronoun they prefer to use. So my pronoun is she. But before we come to that, we'll move right on to the first 4 speakers. I'll introduce the speakers, and then they'll have their intervention, and then we go through the panel. It's my great pleasure to introduce the first speaker to this event, who is Dainius Pūras, Special Rapporteur on the right of everyone to enjoy the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Mr. Pūras has been appointed by the Human Rights Council in 2014. He's a medical doctor with notable expertise on mental health and child's health. Dainius Pūras is a professor and the head of the Center for Child Psychiatry, Social Pediatrics at the Vilnius University, and teaches as well at Vilnius University in Lithuania. He's a human rights advocate who has been actively involved during the last 30 years in the process of transforming public health policies and services with special focus on the rights of children, persons with mental disabilities, and other groups in vulnerable situations. He was the founder of the Lithuanian Society of Families with Children who have intellectual disability and the first president of the Lithuanian Psychiatric Association, the dean of the Faculty of Medicine of the Vilnius University, and is the chairman of the board of the Global Initiative on Psychiatry and the Human Rights Monitoring Institute. He served on UN Committee on the Rights of the Child and has been an independent expert and consultant to a number of governments, as well as NGOs, UN agencies, and programs in the field of the right to health. He's just published his report on Tuesday, which I bet many of you have listened to his comments to. And while the report is clearly not trans-specific, and I don't think it should be, still, I think much of what's in that report is strongly resonates with the experience of trans persons. The power imbalances between medical practitioners and users of mental health care, for example, questions around informed consent, and the pathologization of identities as such, and the stigma and discrimination that comes with that. I'll stop here because Mr. Pūras is way better to elaborate on that. The floor is yours.
Thank you. It is a pleasure for me to be a part of this side event and to share with you some insights related to theme of this side event, but also to my report, which I presented to Human Rights Council 2 days ago. In this report on right to mental health, I underline that current status quo situation in mental health care systems in addressing individual mental health, societal mental health, is unacceptable, and that serious change is needed. And I suggest, instead of what is now happening, to speak about crisis, about global burden of disorders. I think that the mental health systems and policies are too much fixated on so-called disorders. But I suggest that crisis is a global burden of obstacles, and I identify 3 major groups of obstacles for realization of the right to mental health, which is overuse of biomedical model, both in assessment and in management, in interventions. Also, I warn about the huge asymmetry of power between providers and users of services in mental health, and about biased use of knowledge and evidence when stakeholders are misinformed about evidence in mental health. I elaborate more on rights of persons with psychosocial disabilities in this report, although I also comment in this report on issue of today's event. I would like to read one of parts of my report. It is important to recognize the complex role that diagnosis of mental disorder plays in people's lives. While many people find diagnostic categories beneficial in allowing them to access services and better understand their mental health, others find diagnostic categories unhelpful and stigmatizing. Mental health diagnoses have been misused to pathologize identities. Louder? Mental health diagnoses have been misused to pathologize identities and other diversities, including tendencies to medicalize human misery. The pathologization of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex persons reduces their identities to diseases which compounds stigma and discrimination. So, as you know, the CRPD, just because I emphasize more psychosocial disabilities in this report, CRPD convention more than 10 years ago sent a very clear message that medical model which emphasizes pathology and then paves the way to some strange attempts to cure this pathology should be abandoned, and that barriers, obstacles should be now identified not in the bodies or brains of people, but in environment and social attitudes that prevent from realization of rights and needs. But this is valid also for conditions which could be called as diversities. I mean, not disabilities, but diversities. These are conditions related to sexual orientation and gender identity, but also autism, autistic people with autistic features, human misery, which very often is medicalized and as clinical depression. Psychiatry may be even more than the rest of medicine has agreed or accepted this role, this tendency to occupy territories of everyday life and to declare new territories as belonging now to medicine and psychiatry. And in this game, so to say, state policymakers and legal systems, they delegate decision-making on very serious issues to experts of psychiatry. And this turned into systemic disaster. So I should say into escalating of phenomenon of pathologization and medicalization of people on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, but also other conditions. As you all know, there are good news about things changing for better. Our common goal, I think, is to reach that identities are depathologized, and right to have those identities is legally recognized, and people exercise a right to make self-determined decision about their bodies. This is a broader issue of depathologizing diverse experience, including gender diversity in infancy, childhood, adolescence. This will also help. It's my maybe naive thinking, and I send this message in my report to a very powerful group of psychiatry globally and nationally. This could help medicine and psychiatry, as psychiatric associations are happy that they started the pathologization of homosexuality some time ago. And so the problem I see is that diagnosis pave the way to different kind of very wrong so-called cures, such as conversion therapies, corrective interventions, institutionalization, other forms of institutional violence, the eugenic justification of legally coerced sterilization, and so on. I liked a very powerful image for International Day of Action for Trans depathologization think it was 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago, an empty chair among other empty chairs and in empty waiting room, because no one should wait to be interrogated and analyzed and wait for psychological test results or wait for diagnostic permission just to have right to be as they are. So one of major stakeholders, of course, these reports like this is for states mainly, but as we know, states still rely on psychiatric profession as experts. So this, for me, this means that psychiatry is at the crossroads and has a good chance to align with human rights. There are so many tragic events happening in history of psychiatry that psychiatry was trying to cure people and forgetting that first you should not harm. And one last comment is that another issue we face is persistent moral panic of certain groups of population, and they make pressure on policymakers. They escalate traditional family protection of traditional family values, and confront reality in the field of diversity of human beings and human rights. And in this post-truth era, we will have many battles awaiting for us, educating general public, policymakers, doctors, and other people about human rights, about what is health about, what is mental health about, and what is evidence. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. So we move on to our next speaker. Vitit Muntarbhorn to my far right, to your left. Mr. Muntarbhorn was designated in September 2016 as the first UN independent expert on violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity by the Human Rights Council here. Mr. Muntarbhorn is an international law professor and was educated in the UK and Belgium. He's currently a professor emeritus of law at the Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. Professor Muntarbhorn has served on many United Nations bodies. He was formerly the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. He has also been Special Rapporteur of the UN Commission on Human Rights on the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. He was the chair of the International Commission of Inquiry on the Ivory Coast in 2011 and was one of the commissioners of the Independent International Commission of the Inquiry in Syria from 2012 to 2016. Professor Muntarbhorn has extensive experience in research, policy development, and advocacy in the field of sexual orientation and gender identity. He was the co-chairperson of the drafting committee of the Yogyakarta Principles on the application of international human rights law in the relation to sexual orientation and gender identity in 2006 already. As we know, he has just presented his first report to the Human Rights Council this week and developed from the 5 linchpins many of us have listened to him presenting earlier this year. As well in this building, I think he has developed them into 6 underpinnings, and he just told me he's going to have 7 points today. So I'm very curious about those as well, in particular in the context of transgender persons and mental health. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. And what you just heard from Chair, you can forget, because I'm just a simple volunteer. And I'm here with the voluntary spirit to help, that's all. 7 points in 7 minutes, roughly, but I have a little prologue of 2 half points. Number 1 is a life story. In Thailand, my country, at a certain point in time, the conscription military form had a little section where you had to fill in your gender identity of sorts. And when trans people would be vetted by the military, the form would be filled in at that point in time as mentally ill. So this case was taken up to the administrative court with great advocacy from NGOs, as well as friends, as well as, of course, the stakeholders themselves. And after a few years, we won. The form had to be adjusted. So now there is no form that says mentally ill It's been adjusted with the help of the good military. And the Thai version of what is filled in today is this: gender different from that at birth. That's the Thai version. But someone somewhere translated it into English and became gender identity disorder. Which version do you prefer? I think the local Thai version sounds better. And sometimes local perceptions, local inputs could help also international classifications and wording which sound a bit stigmatizing. So that's the first hard point. And the second hard point is this: there is no substitute for good, comprehensive health care. And it will resolve many of the issues that I will look to in a moment. 7 quick points. Because so many of them are due to lack of access to quality health care. So instead of just looking at this from SOGI perspective, look at it from the other angle of the need to build quality health care for all, particularly on mental health, as well as everything else for everyone. Prologue. 7 points quickly. Number 1, let's test this issue, particularly from my 6 points that are found in the study that was shared in the Council recently, from a mental health angle. Number 1, I advocate decriminalization of consensual same-sex relations and also the negative impact of some criminal laws. Now, what do those mean for mental health issues? We have some 70 countries that still criminalize same-sex relations. We have some countries that punish cross-dressing, allegedly imitating another gender. We have the indirect impact of public decency laws, sometimes linked with anti-drugs, anti-prostitution, and so on. And we have forced conversion therapies in many countries still, as well as the criminal law sanction types of implications of less open religious laws, harshly imposed at times on people with mental consequences. So this decriminalization pertains to this variety of issues, all of which have mental health implications. Secondly, effective anti-discrimination measures. Well, good to have in the books, in the Constitution and so on, but very often the practical aspects of discrimination, even if you have a good law, the practical aspects are often negative. One issue is quality health care with quality health professionals. At times, it is the health professionals who discriminate. So we need to build the wherewithal together with the laws so as to have caring community for all, including on mental health issues. And there was a wonderful success story that I witnessed recently in one country I visited. The nurse looking after health issues was a trans woman. And that was so nice as a success story because I'd been hearing other stories in regard to transgender women being on the streets, in precarious conditions, being harmed and so on. But here was a success story of a transgender woman as a nurse, as part of the health professionals to help overcome discrimination. So let's look for positive stories as well. Thirdly, recognition of self-perceived gender identity and related issues. Well, many countries don't recognize your self-perceived gender identity still, even if you have surgery. Many countries. And in Europe, where there's an openness to changing gender identity on the basis of self-perceived gender identity, some 20 countries still force people to have surgery or sterilization. Today, we have the European Court of Human Rights judgment from April, which says that there should be no forced surgery, no forced sterilization, with due regard to gender recognition in that respect. But the court itself was not clear on one issue, and that was and is, what about counseling and psychological tests before being allowed to change one's gender? It is not settled. And the trans friends here have to advocate what they feel is best. I don't like coercion. I am in favor of voluntary nature of medical, psychological help. Fourthly, Anti-stigma, anti-pathologization if it leads to stigma. Well, gays were classified internationally as mentally ill in 1990, now no longer, but we don't quite know what happens locally. Please send us information, because this is a traumatic situation, and people are still being forced into conversion therapy. And today we have initiatives of some governments pushing for reporting of gays so as to discriminate against them, media campaigns against them, as well as the hate speech. And in regard to the trans group, of course, we have the World Health Classification still, which is now being negotiated in terms of lightening, alleviating the previous stigma, but it's not settled yet. And we look forward to a humane approach in terms of the recognition of people being what they are as part of human diversity. And this is also very much linked with access to healthcare, insurance, comprehensive healthcare, and our friends from the trans community can tell us very well what is best here in terms of destigmatization and assurance of access to quality healthcare, comprehensive healthcare, where we don't need to worry too much about the insurance companies from the private sector. Fifth, sociocultural inclusion, access to the basics of life, meaning also access to quality healthcare writ large, including mental health. And here we need good advocacy for inclusion, particularly from community leaders, political leaders, religious leaders, medical leaders. How many doctors are sitting here, please? Hands up. It cannot be. It cannot be. Please. We must work harder together to have the doctors here, enlightened doctors and less enlightened doctors, so we negotiate with them as part of socio-cultural inclusion in practice here in this place in situ. SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, also invite us to use those goals well to advocate, to leave no one behind, also on health issues. Sixth, finally, education and empathy. Health education, anti-bullying education, human rights education, they're all linked with a mental perspective. But let's get grounded, not just norms. How do you do it in practice from a young age? Anti-bullying is very important. We have to negotiate with the parents, we have to negotiate with the religious leaders and beyond. But do it gradually, with due empathy for practical lessons at the field level. And learning by doing is very important. Get everybody out to do some voluntary work with HIV-affected people. That's a way of learning healthcare mentally through sharing and through building compassion and empathy. And finally, seventh point, what next? Well, implementation of human rights for mental health strengthening also invites various actions as transversal, intersectional, intersectoral cooperation, including good laws and policies, good laws, particularly national health laws, national health policies, good policies in terms of development policies together with national health policies, good programming, health programming, LGBT programming and beyond, good case enforcement, such as the administrative court in Thailand. Very often the changes come not from the executive branch that vote here, whom I respect, but the changes come from judiciaries and parliamentarians in many of our countries, as well as the powerful lobby of the doctors who must be here with us. Mechanisms, fifth, and personnel, including good health personnel. Sixth, resources, budgets for health, sustain it, irrespective of the government in power. Seventh, data and monitoring, including disaggregation. 8, education, capacity building, including health education, a less binary approach. 9th, remedies and accountability. Germany is going to pay up now for the victims from the Third Reich, 50,000 people who must have suffered very much mentally. And finally, 10, the space for participation, networking, and mobilization. Inclusive approach, voices heard, possibilities for reform, activation, and acting together. SDGs are also with us to inspire change, to work together, to leave no one behind, and no one behind means no one, also in regard to mental health. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that was a lot of food for thought, and we'll do a little intermezzo because the panel has now spoken a lot, and you need to make up for that in the audience, which is why I'll give you 3 minutes to do the following. Talk to your neighbor left and right. If you're sitting next to someone you've not met before, introduce yourself. If you know the person, skip that. And discuss 3 questions, which are: what has been striking for you to hear in the 2 first interventions? What has been new to you? What has been interesting? What do you take from that, from either of the presentations? After 2 minutes, you're going to hear this bell. And after 3 minutes, I'm going to cut you and move on with the panel. Good luck with the discussion. The next speaker I have the pleasure to introduce is someone who comes right to the point, I think. It's Viviane Vigueiro. Viviane is a trans feminine activist from Brazil. She's the project coordinator at Akahata, a group on genders and sexualities. She's a PhD student on gender and feminist studies at the Federal University of Bahia. Viviane, floor is yours.
Thank you, Julia. Good morning, everyone. And today I'm very glad to share in such amazing company some intersectional thoughts, which is a feminist concept genealogically, on trans people, mental health, and human rights. As a trans activist and a researcher on gender and decolonial studies. And the first thing I wanted to say is that trans and gender diverse peoples have been historically regarded as bodies to be hated and cuerpos para odiar. And that's something I take from Claudia Rodriguez, a Chilean travesti activist. When trans people are jailed in inappropriate prisons or assassinated, when families exert violence against their children's human rights, and when legislations and courts deny or demand unacceptable requirements for the recognition of our self-determined gender identities, I believe Claudia's words precisely refer to what Agnes Callamard's reflections on a broader understanding of arbitrariness, of what arbitrariness means. In this sense, through direct actions, through omissions in the educational and healthcare systems, and the gatekeeping of the fulfillment of our experiencing of our human rights, various states foster such hatred against our communities and our bodies and existences. Therefore, as communities and allies, I consider that historicizing such hatred is a critical aspect in honoring the lives of those of us who have not survived, of those of us who live and lived through forced treatments and procedures, of those of us who struggle daily to access the human rights and well-being we are entitled to. In particular, I regard this historicization as a potential decolonial act and hope that we can advance in this and other acts further throughout our dialogues today and outside of here as well, thinking about, firstly, how intersectionality might be a useful concept to advance the perceptions on our social cultural erasure and simplification. And secondly, how the human rights framework might destabilize hegemonic understandings about care for trans people's mental health. I intend to focus on 2 aspects in this regard. How our erasure is linked to colonial projects, and secondly, how science can be regarded as a political domain. About erasure. The erasure of gender diversities has close relations to the development of genocidal colonial projects. In this sense, the elimination of nonconformities of gender identities and sexualities was used as one of the justifications for the political, economic, and military occupation of supposedly new worlds. In this sense, intersectionality not only provides the acknowledgement of multiple axes of oppression, but also facilitates an analytical rationale to consider the articulation through history. Common power dispositives and their usefulness in producing hierarchies between human beings, societies, and cultures. In modern and contemporary times, science has emerged materially from the colonial projects as a political domain that has continually produced hierarchies and violence. Given the short amount of time we have, I'd like to highlight three intersectional elements that could make us cautious about trusting the hegemonic and disproportionately funded, as Dainius perfectly stated, biomedical model and its relations with gender identity. First, the acceptance of heterosexuality as a concept involved the struggle of various activists and allies against violent conceptions on sexual orientations, not being a mere consequence of a neutral and objective scientific development. The same with the depathologization of homosexuality. Secondly, scientific racial ideologies have heavily relied on supremacist and flawed views about bodies and social groups, which have influenced state policies for immigration. I'll briefly mention the example of Brazil with its whitening policies in the 20th century, sponsoring European immigrants to come to our country to supposedly civilize our nation, among other consequences. And thirdly, the epistemic limits and interests involved in Western or Westernized perspectives about gender identities, linked to power asymmetries and lack of participation of marginalized stakeholders. This constitutes a limited model of care that prevents many people in our communities from experiencing the full breadth of their human rights. Corley Driscoll, a two-spirit author, says that a colonized sexuality is one in which we have internalized the sexual values of dominant culture. I think this resonates with many of us trans people. And similarly, I would like to ask you, could we think of what colonized gender identities mean? And to what extent can we regard the naturalization of cisgender or non-trans identities as dependent on the very production of the abnormality of trans and gender diverse ones? What makes you, who are not trans in this room, a man or a woman? That's a fairly frequent question we get as trans people. What produces the relative needlessness of your concern about pronouns and gender markers in documents? Decolonizing gender identities require that we denaturalize cisgenderness as a norm which produces what is deemed healthy, desirable, and correct regarding gender identities. And for that to happen, we need to carry out an analysis of the political economy involved in this production. And I say that as a Marxist terrorist as well. I believe in the potential for the human rights framework to challenge this norm and political economy, acknowledging such framework as a political domain as well. And I look forward for this dialogues, and thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks. Spot on time. So there's hardly anything to do for me here. So right on, let's move on to the fourth speaker then, which is Mauro Cabral Grinspan. Mauro is the Executive Director of GATE, Global Action of Trans Equality, and coordinates the GATE initiative on the process of revision and reform of the International Classification of Diseases. He participated in the elaboration of the Yogyakarta Principles and endorsed them as one of their signatories, and is currently involved in the YP+10 revision process. He researches, writes, teaches, and advocates on issues of gender identity, gender expression, and bodily diversity, including trans, intersex, fat, and HIV issues. At the national level, he coordinates the Argentinian task force Justicia Intersex. Mauro has been involved in the production and revision of key official documents, including the Interagency Statement on Forced, Coercive, or Otherwise Involuntary Sterilization, the WHO Report on Sexual Health, Human Rights, and the Law, and the Report on Gender Issues by the former Special Rapporteur on Torture. It's my pleasure. Mauro, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Last year I was traveling. I think when I travel, I depend on live stream, to see movies and series in order to resist life at the UN, and I was watching a series called Sense8, and there was a trans character there, a trans woman, and in one scene, she woke up in a hospital, her mother is there, also her sister, is a doctor there, and all of them inform her they are going to fix him. And she is tied up to the bed, she's not allowed to leave, she is informed that her identity actually is a symptom of a very serious mental disorder. That scene really freaked me out, and not only because it was really good performed, it's just because that is one of the most terrorizing fantasies that many trans people have, including myself. But to be honest, we don't need to go to fiction in order to know or to share that story. It's just today, when I was talking with another trans person about this event, this person that I have known for a long time told me a story involving their own life and being institutionalized by their family being 8 years old. So the psychopathologization of trans people is being classified as a person with a mental disorder just because of who we are, is one of the experiences that constitutes what it means to be a trans and/or a gender diverse person today. And just to be clear, the only difference between trans people and those who are not trans, the people that we call cisgender or cis people, is that trans people identify in a gender that is different to the sex assigned by third parties, like doctors at birth. So those who have that experience are classified as mentally disordered people. Those who identified in the sex that was assigned to them at birth are considered to be healthy people in terms of mental health. This classification, this distinction, this arbitrary distinction between two perfectly healthy human experiences produce structural oppression and exclusion against trans people. And they work denying, on a structural basis again, our autonomy and self-determination. And as our identities are perceived to be internal compared with the external manifestation of our gender expressions and our personalities, it also means that people justify it to have someone else, like a psychiatrist, assessing that inner truth of our own personalities, to examine, to test, to assess, to find out that pathological truth about ourselves that we consider to be our identity. So from the very beginning, our identities, our bodies, the way in which we express ourselves and our sexuality are pathologized. Psychopathologization and pathologization in general have different consequences for trans people. And maybe, usually in UN documents, people always start talking about stigma and discrimination. I'm not going to do that just because one reason, that is the following one. When we talk about mental health, the key problem there, when it comes to be about trans people, but also for anyone with a diagnosis of mental disorder, is the stigma associated usually with mental disease or mental health issues. So in that sense, we are not saying, like the international movement of trans people working against trans pathologization, we don't say that we don't have a mental disorder because having a mental disorder is stigmatizing. Actually, stigma needs to be removed from all mental disorders. We're saying that we don't have a mental disorder because being ourselves can never be a disorder in itself. But anyway, if we advance the issue of the consequences, we know that pathologization makes requirements that are incompatible with human rights standards acceptable for many people, including many governments. Those requirements include, for example, of course, a mental health diagnosis, but also institutionalization in the case of some countries, but also sterilization. And trans people, as many people with diagnosis of mental disorder, have been subjected to sterilization or are required to be sterilized in order to have access to a very basic human rights, which is the right to legal gender recognition. So a diagnosis is also required for trans people to get access to transitional healthcare, to gender-affirming healthcare and its coverage. And the independent expert on SOGI issues clearly pointed out to that problem, which is that we need to pay, with a diagnosis, the right to incarnate, to live in our own bodies. Because in some very strange cis fantasy, it is possible for trans people to be ourselves and to have a body that doesn't depend on that gender identity. And we need a third party, an expert mental health professional, to assess if the identity that we are claiming as our own, could allow us to have access to transitional healthcare, which is to inhabit the body that we feel as ours. And it was mentioned already in this panel, forced treatment, conversion therapies, reparative therapies are strongly linked with pathologization of trans experiences. And I'm saying this as a survivor of that kind of experiences. When I was 15 years old, I was given antipsychotic medication because I identify as a boy, basically, not for other reason. That thing that happened 30 years ago in Argentina keeps happening today in the rest of the world. However, there is a very interesting, paradox, a very complicated one, associated with trans people and mental health. Because we are pathologized at that extent, and it's very difficult for us to get access to mental health services when we have other needs connected with mental health. So as many other people, trans people suffer from depression, for traumatic experiences, we suffer from anxiety, we are bipolar or schizophrenic, but when we try to get access to mental health services, usually what is treated or identified as the key problem is our gender identity and the way in which we express ourselves, which has the paradoxical effect of making impossible for us to get access to quality services in terms of mental health. But there is another layer to that barrier, which is that being a trans person in this world today means to be exposed not only to cis-sexism, but also to transphobic violence. Which means that in a region like mine, with the life expectation for trans women is 35 years old, it means that transphobia and transphobic violence produce a special kind of mental suffering, which is connected with the experience of seeing people around you dying and to know that you could be dying the next after that. So far, there are almost no services, mental health services, addressing the consequences of transphobia in trans lives. So, from our perspective, addressing trans issues in the context of mental health from a human rights framework requires not only to remove stigma and discrimination associated with mental health in general, and with trans people mental health in particular, but it requires to examine and to dismantle pathologization as a general framework, as a framework that is extremely connected with hospitality, with the way in which a dominant cis world received and welcome or unwelcome trans people. It means to dismantle the hierarchies, including that hierarchy created by pathologization, that makes cis lives worth living while trans lives are not. Just to finish, I want just to make explicit for all of us here, for the people that are following this on live stream, that this is really a historical event for survivors of mental health violence in general, for trans people in particular, and I want you to know that you are being part of of it, and it's really great to have all of you here. And because many of us are survivors of that violence, this event is also an event of justice, a moment of justice, so to be able just to come forward and to see that we are starting to turn the tide on trans pathologization, and that human rights violations in mental health settings will be stopped in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mauro. And before we discuss how to turn the tide and have interventions, we'll have another 90 seconds intermezzo from all of you, because again, we've been talking on the panel, you haven't, so you need to again make up for that. This time, I'd like to ask you to turn to your colleague and neighbor again and ask or discuss, if you were the first person making a question or a comment, what would that question or comment be, and why is that interesting? If you don't want to share your great question, you need to make up another one. You'll have 90 seconds for that. Again, you're going to hear the bell, and let me take that opportunity to tell the story of that bell. I got it in outside of Sana'a in Yemen more than 10 years ago, in a very tiny shop. There was a person who had an empty hull of a grenade of that size, and he made bells and scissors of that. And for me, that stands for the hope for peace and for human rights. And I think this is why it deserves to be heard in a space like that. You'll hear it in 90 seconds.